While Parliament has been hopelessly paralysed by the Prime Minister's refusal to do the decent thing and resign, I hope this debate allows us an opportunity to discuss the human reality of this government's cost of living crisis. Because up and down this country, Mr Deputy Speaker, people are facing the anxiety that comes from worrying about whether they can pay their bills and heat their homes. Deciding whether to eat or heat is an awful indictment of Britain in the 2020s. If that decision has to be made by one person, it's one person too many. But under this government, millions of people are having to make that decision. And there is total inaction, nothing to say. There aren't even any of this week's light parliamentary timetable to help. The Minister himself, in the near 20 minutes he spoke, gave nothing to help families in this country in the cost of living crisis. They could have even, and I'm sure the member for Glasgow East would have allowed, put an amendment down to the motion today that we could have all voted for and backed to help the people of this country with the cost of living crisis. But radio silence. And that's because this inaction, and because of this inaction, more and more face hardship and worry. Inflation is at more than 5%, a 30-year high. Energy bills are to rise by 40%, on average £700 per household shortly. The average UK worker is still not any better off than they were when this government took power over a decade ago. And the Chancellor is planning the largest tax hike in living memory, taking the tax burden on working people to its highest since 1950. What a record! A high tax, high inflation, low-growth Tory party. This weekend, we are led to believe that the entire Cabinet would get behind stopping the planned national insurance tax rise. And what do we hear today? The Chancellor turning against his own national insurance hike by calling it the Prime Minister's tax. This is a whole new definition of the Chancellor of tax dodging. Nobody in the country is buying it. Bring it back to this House if you want to vote this national insurance rise down. The human cost of this is stark. In the last year, Citizens Advice Scotland has seen a 38% increase in the number of people coming to them for advice about being unable to pay their mortgage. It's much higher for those unable to pay their rent. And polling conducting on behalf of the same organisation found 500,000 Scots cutting back on their food spending in order to pay their energy bills this winter before these huge rises. What's worse, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that official statistics on inflation don't capture the full extent of the difficulty facing families, especially those on low incomes. The food blogger Jack Monroe, who rose to fame with recipes showing how to cook family meals for less than £10 a week, highlighted this on social media over the weekend. They gave examples of the cost of the cheapest pasta in the local supermarket rising by 141% in the last year, the cheapest bag of rice rising 344%, and baked beans rising 45% year on year. At the same time, those on the lowest incomes have seen universal credit cut and their budgets tightened even further. To make matters worse, and the member for Glasgow East mentioned this, rises in filling up the car to their highest level ever, and whilst they rise like a rocket, they fall like a feather, needlessly costing families much more. And Brexit, infiltrating supply chains, making it much more difficult to get food into the country, increasing costs in our supermarkets. That's the reality, not of a global market, but of this government's decision-making. Families working every hour under the sun, but still unable to make ends meet, and the position getting worse, not better. Happy to give way.
Very grateful to my constituency neighbour for giving way. He's talking about the price of food in supermarkets. You'll have heard me put to the Minister earlier the problems identified by the British Retail Consortium about labour shortages affecting the food supply chain. And we've all, of course, unless you're watching the BBC, we've all seen the queues at the Kent ports over the weekend. So what I really want to ask him is, what assessment have the Labour Party made of the impact of Brexit on food price increases, and what do the Labour Party intend to do about these problems of labour shortages and supply shortages caused by Brexit?
Well, thank you to my constituency neighbour for that question, and I hope she watched with great interest the Leader of the Labour Party's speech just a few weeks ago, and indeed before Christmas, the other speech he made about making Brexit work, because the reality is that this Conservative government have given us a position whereby Brexit doesn't work. We have a thin deal that we said would fall apart and is falling apart, and what we have to do is to get into power in order to fix the problems with that and also to build on that relationship. That's the reality of where we are. And I did listen with interest to the Minister not answering your question before about HGV drivers and the cost of food and supply chains. And the Minister rightly said there's an ageing workforce, which shows you the government have not planned for the medium to long term with regards to that workforce. It's as if everyone's just got older overnight rather than there being some plan. It just sums this government up that they haven't had the foresight to see some of these problems coming. And indeed all the promises from the Brexiteers opposite that we were promised in terms of those sunny uplands have indeed not come to pass, and the opposite has indeed come to pass. And you can see that in the supermarkets and with regards to pricing itself. Mr Deputy Speaker, I was saying that those of us elected to this place owe it to the millions of people across this country facing such hardship to do everything we can to alleviate and change it. In the UK in 2022, nobody should have to choose between heating and eating. This government has shown no compassion or even pretending to care. Remember, they voted to cut the £20 a week universal credit uplift for the poorest in the country and refused to feed schools in the holidays. Refused to feed school kids in the holidays. The only response to this crisis so far from this government, in all the noise of Partygate and everything else, is the government snuck out a £4.3 billion fraud write-off from COVID funds in business loans, branded, and I quote, nothing less than woeful, by their very own anti-fraud minister in the other place, the Lord Agnew, shortly before he resigned from the dispatch box a few hours ago in the other place. Maybe the minister would like to do the same this afternoon, get to the dispatch box, resign, grab his folder and suitcase full of wine and head for the hills. With any minister with any kind of morality would be doing just the same thing. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased the SNP has called this debate, but not the bystanders in this crisis either. They are the government in Scotland. They have been the government in Scotland for 15 years. I will give way in a second. A 33-year-old today, struggling to feed their family while paying their energy bills, has spent their entire adult life under the Scottish National Party Scottish Government. Such a person might wonder why the SNP did not support legislation put forward by Labour colleagues in Holyrood to enshrine as a human right the right to food. Perhaps we might be able to find out this afternoon why. And parliamentary time will be taken up, and I quote, in weeks for legislation for another referendum. People are having to choose between heating and eating, and this will be their priority in Parliament and elsewhere for months. And I accept that Parliament has the capacity to do other things. But if anybody is under any illusions that all the oxygen and vacuum will not be taken up in Scotland with regards to another referendum or the thought of another piece of referendum legislation, doesn't know the reality of what will happen. And with the paralysis in this place, the Scottish Government is obsessed by what gets them out of bed in the morning rather than the real everyday issues of Scots. Happy to give way to the member from Kilmarnock.
Thank you for giving way. Whilst talking about the action of the Scottish Government, I presume he's going to commend the Scottish Government for bringing forward the £20 a week child payment as one way to help mitigate poverty being imposed by Westminster. But earlier on he also said we've all got a duty in this place to try and help people with regards to cost of living and the energy crisis. So in that case, why did Labour vote for the nuclear financing bill, which had an impact statement that said it could add up to £63 billion to household energy bills? How on earth is that helping people with this energy crisis?
Mr Speaker, what a valuable intervention at that time, because I was just about to go on to talk about the child payment, in fact, and indeed we campaigned for the £20 child payment for some time in the Scottish Parliament, and we're delighted that the Scottish Government eventually brought that in after some time. But what we would like now, and all the Scottish charities are saying this, is that this is a key targeted intervention that helps out with child poverty, that it should be increased and doubled to £40 per week in terms there. And I hear from a sedentary position everybody behind me saying, what would you cut? Which is surely the same dilemma that they've just been arguing about the government opposite in terms of what they would do in terms of budget. So what I would do is I wouldn't spend money on an independence referendum, and I would feed hungry Scottish children instead. Such a move, Mr Deputy Speaker. So you would think that the SNP seem to have woken up It tells you all you need to know when this government are in the total disarray, that rather than turning their guns on them, they're turning their guns on the Labour Party. And that might be all you need to know in terms of the way Scottish politics works. Such a move, Mr Deputy Speaker, of doubling the Scottish child payment, and where would we get the money from? They keep shouting. Such a move would take 80,000 Scottish children out of poverty overnight. So I'll tell you what, let's find the money indeed with all these vanity projects in terms of the wastage we've seen in Scotland. I'm going to give way if you tell us how much you've spent on ferries that have been wasted.
I'll never giving way. But perhaps when he's talking about turning his guns on the opposition, perhaps if he was so utterly thorough to Trident missiles, that perhaps then we could find the money to lift Scottish children out of poverty. But while the Labour Party remains thorough to Trident, we cannot do it.
It's a strange thing that over the last 5 minutes in this House, we've heard SNP MP after MP justifying why they cannot lift 80,000 children out of poverty. If that doesn't tell you that this country is stuck between two bad governments, then nothing will. Happy to give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and unfortunately on these benches we've got to turn our guns everywhere because there are very few guns behind him at the moment. But one of the things that I would say to the honourable gentleman is he's got this focus on social security and what we can do, which I would agree with him about how we alleviate poverty and inequality. So can you therefore come to the dispatch box and tell us that in the next Labour manifesto you'll commit to abolishing the welfare cap, which they had nothing to say about 2 weeks ago?
There wasn't a vote on the welfare cap a few weeks ago, Mr Deputy Speaker. It was about giving more money to people, the poorest people in this country, and they indeed know that. And indeed, I do take umbrage with the member for Glasgow East in terms of the number of people on the Labour benches, because the criticism we always get during Opposition Day debates brought by the SNP is that the Labour Party are taking up too much time when it's their debate. So actually, we do leave most of the time for the SNP members to be able to speak, and that has always been the case. They complain constantly that they don't get enough time in this place, so they're now going to get as much time as they like today. But I'm delighted at the intervention, Mr Deputy Speaker, because I'm going to repeat this paragraph again, because young children and families in Scotland might be wondering why the Scottish Government will not listen to charities or indeed Scottish Labour's policy and increase the Scottish child payment to £40 a week. They cry, where would we get the money from? Such a move would lift 80,000 Scottish children out of poverty, and it could be done under the powers of the Scottish Government tomorrow. Wasting money on ferries, wasting money on Prestwick, wasting money on vanity projects, underwriting the GUPT organisation that puts £500 million onto the taxpayer of Scotland. That is what we need to be doing, is focusing on. And incidentally, I'll just finish this point on this particular fact, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Scottish Government passed their budget last month, and they pushed incredible cuts onto local authorities, and then turned round to those local authorities and says, if you want the money to be able to run local services, put it on council tax. Nothing affects Scottish people more than having to pay massively increased council tax bills because the Scottish Government are slashing the budgets of local government. There is no better example of dither and delay than the devolution of these welfare powers. In 2016, we agreed on a cross-party basis for the devolution of a whole host of welfare powers to the Scottish Parliament. And indeed, the Scottish Parliament could now, in essence, create its own welfare system if it had implemented these policies. 6 years on, they have still delayed the full implementation of these policies. In fact, it will take till 2025 to take full control of these devolved policies. And this is why it's important. This is why it's important. With skyrocketing energy bills and increasing child poverty, these powers could be used as an example to give a supplement to the winter fuel payment to help pensioners stretched by increased fuel bills. That's what should be happening in terms of welfare power changes in Scotland, but they can't, because the welfare powers haven't yet gone through as they should have been. I must give credit, though, to the SNP Scottish Government, because over the last 15 years, and we know this is the best way out of poverty, is to create highly skilled, highly paid jobs. They have created a host of highly skilled jobs in turbine development, the construction of ferries and in steel manufacturing. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, none of those jobs have been in Scotland. They've been in China, they've been in Turkey, they've been in Poland and elsewhere. So decisions that government make have a fundamental impact on the way in which we deal with these things in Scotland. And the newly announced ScotWind projects, which could generate billions of pounds of economic activity in Scotland, every single job created should be created in Scotland, with fabrication plants, with British Steel and others. Of course, as the cost of living crisis has developed, the Prime Minister is facing some difficulty of his own, isn't he? For while much of the country is about to spend all their income from their jobs on energy, the Prime Minister is spending all of his energy on saving his job. The choice in number 10, it seems, isn't so much about heating or eating, but whether it should be red or white. Little does he know that the cost of living crisis will affect the PM as well as everyone else in this country. Would the Minister like to tell us how much more a suitcase of wine and co-op will cost next year as opposed to this year? And as the Government parties through the night, Mr Deputy Speaker, Labour is offering a serious solution and leadership on this crisis. While the Government is hopelessly distracted by the chaos of its own making and more focused on infighting than tackling people's energy bills, we are calling for the Government to address the situation now. They could bring a motion now to sort this problem. Fully funded measures now to reduce the expected price rise in April on people's energy bills, including a VAT cut on home energy bills, saving most households around £200 or more. Targeted extra support to the squeezed middle, pensioners and lowest earners received £600 extra off their bills, paid for by a one-off windfall tax on the North Sea oil and gas producers who have profited from these price rises. Under this plan, under Labour's plan, every household in Scotland would save more than £180 off their energy bills. 800,000 households in Scotland struggling with the cost of living would get additional support of an extra £400. That's nearly £600 for those hardest hit by these energy price rises. Critical money into the pockets of hard-pressed Scots now. So why everyone is dithering and delaying while we're talking about new referendum bills and why the Prime Minister is more concerned about his job, we are proposing genuine action that would help families pay their bills over this most difficult year. That's the difference Labour and leadership can make, and we will make in power. And with the support of the people of Scotland and across the United Kingdom, that's exactly what we plan to do at the next election, Mr Deputy Speaker.